Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into one of history's most terrifying chapters. A year so catastrophic that it literally changed the course of human civilization forever. We're talking about 1348, the year the Black Death arrived in Europe like an uninvited guest who not only crashed the party but burned down the entire house and salted the earth for good measure. Before we begin this journey into medieval nightmare territory, take a moment to hit that like button if you enjoy these deep dives into history's darkest corners. And don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see our global community come together to explore these stories. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink, because we're about to step into a world where death wasn't just a possibility. It was a daily companion walking alongside every living soul in Europe. Picture this, it's early October 1347, and you're standing on the docks of Kaffa, a bustling Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula. The Black Sea stretches out before you, its waters reflecting the pale autumn sun. Merchant ships bob gently in the harbor, their holds filled with silk, spices, and precious goods from the distant corners of the known world. The air smells of salt, tar, and exotic spices. Sailors shout orders in a dozen languages, porters grunt under heavy loads, and merchants haggle with the practiced intensity of men who've made this their life's work. Everything seems normal, profitable even. The kind of bustling commercial activity that built fortunes and funded expeditions. But there's something else in the air that October morning. Something invisible, patient, and absolutely deadly. It's riding along with those precious goods, nestled among the silk bales and spice sacks, carried by creatures so small that medieval minds couldn't even conceive of their existence. The Mongol Golden Horde had been besieging Kaffa for months, and the siege was going poorly for the attackers. Disease had begun ripping through their ranks, killing soldiers faster than any sword or arrow ever could. But the Mongols, being practical people with a flair for psychological warfare, decided that if they were going to die anyway, they might as well share the experience. They loaded their catapults not with stones or burning pitch, but with the corpses of their own plague victims and hurled them over the city walls. It was biological warfare in its most primitive and terrifying form. The defenders of Kaffa watched in horror as bloated, diseased bodies rained down from the sky like some twisted apocalyptic hailstorm. They tried to dispose of the corpses quickly, throwing them into the sea, but it was too late. The damage was done. Whatever had killed the Mongol soldiers was now loose in the city. Within weeks, people in Kaffa began falling ill. It started quietly, as these things often do. A fever here, some swollen glands there. Nothing that seemed particularly alarming at first. Medieval people were used to illness, after all. Life was hard, sanitation was questionable, and people got sick and died with depressing regularity. But this was different. This was aggressive, fast, and absolutely merciless. The symptoms were unlike anything the city's physicians had ever seen. Victims developed painful, egg-sized swellings in their necks, armpits, and groins. These buboes, as they came to be known, were excruciatingly painful and often burst, releasing a foul-smelling pus. High fevers followed, along with chills, vomiting, and a peculiar darkening of the skin in patches, giving victims an almost bruised appearance. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the speed with which it killed. Unlike other diseases that might linger for weeks or months, this plague could kill a healthy adult in a matter of days, sometimes even hours. People would wake up feeling fine and be dead by sunset. Entire families would be wiped out in less than a week. The city's graveyards quickly overflowed. The Genoese merchants, realizing that their profitable little trading post was turning into a charnel house, did what merchants do best. They ran. They loaded their ships with whatever goods they could salvage and fled westward across the Black Sea, through the Dardanelles, and into the Mediterranean. They thought they were escaping death, but they were actually serving as its travel agents. These fleeing ships carried more than just terrified merchants and luxury goods. They carried rats, lots of them. Medieval ships were floating rat hotels, and these particular rats were hosting their own invisible passengers. Fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. Every port these ships visited became a new launching point for the pandemic. The first ship to reach Western Europe limped into the port of Constantinople in late 1347. By the time it docked, most of the crew was either dead or dying. Those few sailors still alive were covered in the telltale buboes and black patches that would soon become synonymous with the plague. The harbor authorities tried to quarantine the ship, but it was like trying to stop the tide with a fishing net. Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital, the city that had stood as the eastern bulwark of Christianity for over 1,000 years, became ground zero for the plague's European debut. Within months, the death toll was staggering. The Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzene would later write that the plague consumed his empire like fire consumes dry wood, leaving nothing but ash and silence in its wake. But the plague wasn't content to stop at Constantinople. Other ships, other ports, other opportunities for spread beckoned. Throughout the winter of 1347 and into the spring of 1348, merchant vessels carried the plague to Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the southern ports of France and Spain. Each landing was like dropping a lit match into a haystack. The medieval world was perfectly designed for pandemic spread. Cities were crowded, sanitation was primitive, and people lived in close quarters with their animals. Rats thrived in these conditions, and where rats went, fleas followed. Where fleas went, plague bacteria followed. And where plague bacteria went, humans died. What made this particular outbreak so devastating wasn't just the disease itself, but the complete lack of understanding about how it spread. Medieval medicine was still largely based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors and the belief that diseases were caused by bad air or divine punishment. The idea that tiny, invisible creatures could cause disease was centuries away from being discovered. So when the plague arrived, people tried everything they could think of to stop it. They burned aromatic herbs to cleanse the air. They prayed fervently for divine intervention. They blamed the Jews. They blamed the alignment of the planets. They blamed everything except the real culprits, the rats and fleas living right alongside them. By the spring of 1348, the plague had established itself in dozens of Mediterranean ports and was beginning its inexorable march inland. It moved along trade routes, following the paths that merchants, pilgrims, and armies had carved across the continent over centuries. Rivers became highways for infection as barges carried both goods and disease upstream. Roads that had once brought prosperity now brought death. The speed of the plague's spread was breathtaking and terrifying. Modern epidemiologists estimate that it moved across Europe at a rate of about 2 kilometers per day after day, month after month, consuming everything in its path. Entire villages would be thriving one week and completely abandoned the next. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to ghost towns in a matter of months. And this was just the beginning. The ships that had fled Kaffa in late 1347 had set in motion a catastrophe that would ultimately kill between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's entire population. The medieval world as people knew it was about to end, replaced by something darker, stranger, and forever changed by the dance with death that was just beginning. The plague had arrived in Europe, and it was hungry. Very, very hungry. As winter gave way to spring in 1348, the plague that had been quietly establishing itself in Mediterranean ports was ready for its grand European tour. And like any successful touring act, it needed good transportation and marketing. Fortunately for the plague, and unfortunately for everyone else, medieval Europe provided both in abundance. The merchant ships that had fled Kaffa weren't the only vessels carrying death across the Mediterranean. Trade was the lifeblood of medieval Europe, and that blood was about to become very literally infected. Every galley, every cog, every small fishing boat that moved between ports was a potential plague ship. The bustling maritime trade network that had brought prosperity to coastal cities was now their executioner. In January 1348, a Genoese ship arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. The harbor master who boarded the vessel for the routine customs inspection found a scene from a nightmare. Most of the crew was dead, their bodies covered in black boils and reeking of decay. Those few sailors still clinging to life were delirious with fever, begging for water, and covered in the characteristic buboes that marked them as plague victims. The Sicilian authorities, showing more sense than most, tried to turn the ship away. But it was too late. The rats had already jumped ship, as rats do, and they brought their tiny passengers with them. Within days, people in Messina were falling ill. Within weeks, the city's death toll was climbing toward catastrophic levels. What happened next would become a pattern repeated across Europe with mechanical precision. From Messina, the plague spread to Catania, then to Palermo, then to Naples. Each city became a new hub, sending infected merchants, pilgrims, and refugees radiating outward like spokes on a wheel of death. The Genoese, being excellent merchants, had trade connections everywhere. Their ships regularly sailed to Pisa, Genoa, Marseilles, and Barcelona. Each of these cities received their plague deliveries right on schedule. By March 1348, the pestilence had established beachheads all along the northern Mediterranean coast. In Marseilles, the plague announcement came in the form of a ship arriving with every single crew member dead. The vessel drifted into the harbor like a ghost ship, its sails slack, its decks littered with corpses. Local authorities tried to burn the ship, but the rats had already scattered into the city's warehouses and stores. Within a month, Marseilles was experiencing what chroniclers described as a mortality so great that the living could barely bury the dead. The plague didn't just travel by sea. Medieval Europe was crisscrossed by an extensive network of trade routes that connected every major city and many smaller towns. These routes, which had brought prosperity and cultural exchange for centuries, now became highways for death. The Via Francigena, the great pilgrimage route that connected Canterbury to Rome, became a plague superhighway. Pilgrims who had set out on spiritual journeys found themselves carrying death from town to town. Monasteries that had offered shelter to travelers for centuries suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with sick and dying guests, then became plague centers themselves. Merchants were particularly effective plague spreaders because they traveled frequently, carried goods that rats loved to hide in, and had the resources to keep moving even when they were feeling unwell. A cloth merchant who picked up the plague in Genoa might visit Florence, then travel to Paris, spreading the disease at every stop along the way. The plague also rode the rivers. Barges carrying wine from Bordeaux, grain from the Rhineland, and salt from coastal regions became floating incubators for disease. River ports like Avignon, Cologne, and London found themselves dealing with plague outbreaks that seemed to arrive by water. By summer 1348, the pattern was clear and terrifying. The plague followed money, power, and trade. Major commercial centers were hit first and hardest. Then the infection radiated outward along established transportation networks. Venice, the great maritime power, was devastated. Florence, the banking capital, was brought to its knees. Paris, the political heart of France, watched helplessly as bodies piled up in the streets. The chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, writing from Florence, described scenes that seemed to come from a fever dream. Bodies were stacked like cordwood in the streets because there weren't enough living people to bury the dead. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned. Shops stood empty, their owners either dead or fled. The great cloth markets that had made Florence wealthy were silent except for the buzzing of flies. In Siena, construction on the magnificent cathedral suddenly stopped in 1348. Not because of lack of funds, but because there weren't enough living workers to continue the project. The half-finished cathedral still stands today, a stone monument to the moment when the plague brought one of Europe's greatest cities to a grinding halt. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how the plague seemed to target the very people who kept medieval society functioning. Priests, who ministered to the sick, died in enormous numbers. Physicians, who tried to treat plague victims, succumbed to the disease they were trying to cure. Government officials, who maintained order and collected taxes, simply disappeared. In some cities, the death toll among clergy reached 60% or higher. Monasteries that had existed for centuries were wiped out completely. Cathedral chapters that had managed church affairs for generations were reduced to a handful of survivors. The Archbishop of Canterbury died of plague in August 1348, followed by his replacement a few months later. The legal system began to collapse as judges, lawyers, and court officials died. Land ownership became confused as entire families were wiped out, leaving no clear heirs. Trade agreements became meaningless when both parties to a contract were dead. The careful administrative structure that had taken centuries to build simply crumbled. Yet the plague was just getting started. By late 1348, It had established itself in dozens of major cities and was beginning to penetrate into the countryside. Rural areas, which many people had hoped would be safer, were about to discover that isolation was no protection against a disease that traveled with every merchant, every messenger, and every refugee fleeing the devastated cities. The Black Death was no longer just a disease. It was a force of nature, reshaping the very structure of European civilization. And it was still spreading. If you were a medieval peasant living in the countryside during the summer of 1348, you might have initially felt lucky. The cities were dying. Everyone knew that. Refugees from Florence, Paris, Venice, and dozens of other urban centers brought terrifying stories of streets filled with corpses, of entire neighborhoods abandoned, of death moving through cities like wildfire through dry grass. But you lived in a small village, maybe just a few dozen families clustered around a modest stone church, surrounded by fields of grain and pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. The plague was a city problem, surely. Cities were crowded, dirty, sinful places where disease thrived. The countryside was clean, wholesome, blessed by God. You were safe. You were wrong. The plague that devastated Europe's cities was just warming up. The real horror was about to begin in the countryside, where the vast majority of medieval people lived and where the social structure that had held European civilization together for centuries was about to collapse completely. The first sign that something was wrong often came in the form of refugees. City dwellers, desperate to escape the plague-ridden urban areas, fled to the countryside in massive numbers. They came on foot, in carts, on horseback, carrying whatever possessions they could manage and often unknowingly carrying the plague bacteria in their blood. These refugees were generally not welcomed with open arms. Medieval villages were insular communities where everyone knew everyone else, where strangers were viewed with suspicion even in the best of times. During a pandemic, they were seen as harbingers of death itself. Many villages tried to turn refugees away, sometimes violently. But you can't build a wall high enough to keep out fleas and rats. The plague reached rural areas through multiple pathways. Merchants still needed to travel, carrying goods from city to countryside and back again. Church officials moved between parishes. Tax collectors made their rounds. Soldiers marched along country roads. Each of these groups could carry the plague bacteria, and each contact with rural communities created new opportunities for spread. But perhaps most effectively, the plague spread through the very social networks that had made medieval rural life stable and prosperous. Villages weren't isolated islands. They were connected to each other and to larger towns through webs of family relationships, economic ties, and religious obligations. A daughter married into the next village over. A son became a monk at a monastery 20 miles away. Peasants traveled to weekly markets in nearby towns. These connections, which had enriched rural life for generations, now became transmission networks for death. When the plague finally arrived in a village, the results were often even more catastrophic than what had happened in cities. Urban areas, for all their problems, had resources, physicians, medicines, institutions capable of organizing responses to crisis. Rural villages had none of these things. They had a local priest who might know how to read and write, a few people with basic knowledge of herbal remedies, and not much else. The typical medieval village was also perfectly designed for plague transmission. People lived in small, crowded houses, often sharing space with their animals. Grain storage attracted rats, and poor sanitation created ideal conditions for flea reproduction. When plague-infected rats began dying, their hungry fleas sought new hosts among the human population, jumping from person to person with deadly efficiency. Village social structure made things even worse. Medieval rural life was built around extended family groups. Multiple generations lived in close proximity, worked together in the fields, shared meals, and cared for each other when illness struck. This meant that when one family member contracted plague, the entire family was likely to follow within days. The progress of plague through a typical village followed a predictable pattern. It usually started with someone who had contact with the outside world. Perhaps the miller, who traveled to town to sell flour, or a merchant who had visited to buy wool. This index case would sicken and die, but not before infecting family members and close neighbors. Within a week, multiple households would be affected. Within a month, the village might be completely devastated. Chronicles from the period describe villages where only a handful of survivors remained, sometimes just children wandering among houses full of corpses, too young to understand what had happened to their world. The demographic impact was staggering. Some villages lost 70, 80, even 90% of their population. Entire settlements were abandoned, their fields returning to wilderness, their churches falling into ruin. Archaeologists have identified hundreds of lost villages across Europe, communities that simply ceased to exist during the plague years. The agricultural system that fed Europe began to collapse. Peasants who survived the initial wave of plague often fled their villages, abandoning their fields and livestock. Crops rotted unharvested in the fields. Cattle and sheep wandered freely through abandoned settlements. The carefully maintained system of medieval agriculture, which had supported a growing population for centuries, simply fell apart. This agricultural collapse created secondary effects that were almost as devastating as the plague itself. Food became scarce and expensive. Famine followed pestilence. Survivors found themselves not just dealing with the immediate threat of disease, but with the long-term challenge of rebuilding an entire economic system. The social fabric of rural life also unraveled. The feudal system, which had organized European society for centuries, depended on stable relationships between lords and peasants. Lords provided protection and justice in exchange for agricultural labor and military service. But when half the peasants were dead and the survivors were free to leave for better opportunities elsewhere, the entire system became unworkable. Manor houses stood empty as noble families died out. Monasteries, which had been centers of learning and agricultural innovation, were abandoned or reduced to a few elderly monks. Village churches, the spiritual and social centers of rural communities, fell silent as entire parishes were wiped out. Yet perhaps most disturbing was the psychological impact on survivors. Imagine living through the complete destruction of your world, watching everyone you had ever known die horrible deaths, seeing your entire way of life simply vanish. Many survivors suffered what we would now recognize as severe trauma and depression. Some turned to religious extremism, believing the plague was divine punishment requiring extreme penance. Others abandoned religion entirely, concluding that if God existed, he was either powerless or malevolent. The plague also shattered traditional authority structures. When bishops died alongside peasants, when nobles succumbed as quickly as serfs, people began to question the social hierarchies that had seemed divinely ordained. If the plague made no distinction between rich and poor, powerful and powerless, perhaps those distinctions were less meaningful than everyone had believed. This questioning of authority would have profound long-term consequences. The peasant revolts that swept Europe in the decades following the plague, the religious reform movements that challenged church authority, the gradual breakdown of feudalism itself, all had their roots in the social upheaval caused by the Black Death. By the end of 1348, the European countryside was a wasteland. Villages that had thrived for centuries lay abandoned. Fields that had fed thousands grew wild with weeds. The rural population, which had been steadily growing for centuries, had been cut by half or more in a single year. But the plague still wasn't finished. As winter approached, it was preparing for its next act. The systematic destruction of Europe's cities and the collapse of the institutions that had held medieval civilization together. The worst was yet to come. By autumn 1348, Europe's great cities were dying. Not metaphorically, not gradually, but literally and with a speed that defied comprehension. These urban centers, which had been the crown jewels of medieval civilization, were transforming into something out of humanity's worst nightmares. Let's start with Florence, because it was there that we get some of our most vivid first-hand accounts of what the plague did to a major city. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the catastrophe, wrote descriptions that still have the power to chill readers nearly 7 centuries later. Florence in early 1348 was one of Europe's most prosperous cities. Its banks financed trade across the continent. Its textile industry produced the finest cloth in the known world. Its population of around 100,000 made it one of the largest cities in Europe. The Florentines were proud, wealthy, and sophisticated. They considered themselves the inheritors of ancient Roman greatness. Then the plague arrived. Boccaccio described the symptoms with clinical precision. The disease announced itself with swellings in the groin or armpit, some reaching the size of apples, others resembling eggs. These buboes, as they came to be called, were intensely painful and appeared suddenly. From these swellings, the infection spread throughout the body. Dark spots appeared on the arms, thighs, and other parts of the body, sometimes large and sparse, sometimes small and numerous. These spots were as certain a sign of approaching death as the buboes themselves. But it was the speed that truly terrified people. Unlike other diseases, which might linger for weeks or months, the plague killed with shocking rapidity. Healthy people could be struck down in hours. Boccaccio wrote of people who ate dinner with their friends and family, only to die before sunrise. The disease showed no mercy to age, gender, or social status. Babies died in their mother's arms. Young adults in the prime of life collapsed in the streets. Elderly people who had survived decades of hardship succumbed in days. The mortality rate in Florence reached levels that strain credibility. Modern historians estimate that between 60 and 80% of the city's population died within a few months. To put that in perspective, imagine walking through your neighborhood and finding that only 1 or 2 houses out of every 10 still had living occupants. The city's infrastructure simply collapsed under the weight of death. Florence's graveyards, which had served the city for centuries, were overwhelmed within weeks. Bodies were buried in massive trenches, sometimes hundreds at a time, with no individual graves or markers. The church of Santa Maria Novella turned its cloister into a cemetery. The cemetery of San Lorenzo expanded until it covered several city blocks. When even the expanded cemeteries couldn't accommodate the dead, authorities began digging enormous pits outside the city walls. Bodies were layered in these pits like pasta in a lasagna, with thin layers of dirt between levels of corpses. Some pits contained thousands of bodies. The smell of death hung over the city like a physical presence. The living faced impossible choices. Families who could afford it hired professional body collectors, grim men who went from house to house with ox-drawn carts, collecting the dead for mass burial. These collectors, called spazzini, charged enormous fees and often looted the houses they visited. But many families couldn't afford professional collection, and bodies accumulated in homes until the stench became unbearable. Boccaccio described scenes that read like something from a horror story. Entire families would die within days of each other, leaving houses full of corpses with no one to bury them. Neighbors, terrified of contagion, refused to enter plague houses. Bodies were thrown from windows into the streets. Packs of dogs roamed the city, feeding on abandoned corpses. The economic system ground to a halt. Markets closed because merchants were dead or had fled. Workshops fell silent because craftsmen had succumbed to the plague. Banks collapsed because there weren't enough living employees to conduct business. The wool trade, which had made Florence wealthy, simply stopped functioning. Florence wasn't unique. Similar scenes were playing out in every major city across Europe. In Paris, the chronicler Jean de Venette wrote that people died so quickly that the living could barely bury the dead. The city's main cemetery, the Cemetery of the Innocents, became a hellscape of mass graves and rotting corpses. London faced its own nightmare. The plague arrived in the city via the Thames in late 1348, probably carried by ships from continental ports. Within months, the death toll was astronomical. The city's only cemetery, at Smithfield, was quickly overwhelmed. King Edward III ordered the creation of emergency burial grounds outside the city walls. One of these emergency cemeteries, at East Smithfield, has been excavated by modern archaeologists, revealing the true scope of the catastrophe. The East Smithfield Cemetery contains the remains of over 2,400 plague victims, buried in carefully organized rows that speak to the desperate efficiency required to handle such massive mortality. Analysis of the skeletons confirms what the historical sources tell us. The plague killed people of all ages and social classes with equal ferocity. In Venice, the great maritime power that had dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries, the plague struck with particular irony. The city's wealth had been built on its connections to the wider world, on its ships and merchants and trade networks. Now those same connections brought death to its doorstep. Venetian chroniclers described the city's canals clogged with bodies. Gondoliers refused to transport corpses, leading to the bizarre sight of Venice's elegant waterways filled with floating dead. The city's government, normally one of Europe's most efficient, simply broke down as officials died faster than they could be replaced. The plague also devastated Europe's religious centers. Rome, the heart of Western Christianity, saw its population decimated. Pope Clement VI, residing in Avignon rather than Rome, watched helplessly as his church hierarchy was decimated. Bishops, abbots, and priests died in enormous numbers, leaving many parishes without spiritual leadership. The great cathedral schools and universities, which had been centers of learning and intellectual life, fell silent. The University of Paris lost so many faculty members that it had to suspend operations. Oxford and Cambridge saw their student populations collapse. The intellectual flowering that had characterized the High Middle Ages came to an abrupt halt. Perhaps most disturbing was what the plague revealed about the fragility of civilization itself. These great cities, with their magnificent cathedrals, their complex governments, their sophisticated economic systems, their learned universities, proved helpless against a microscopic bacterium. In a matter of months, centuries of human achievement were reduced to rubble and corpses. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Those who lived through the urban catastrophe never forgot what they had seen. They had witnessed the complete breakdown of social order, the failure of every institution they had trusted, the revelation that human civilization was far more fragile than anyone had imagined. Many survivors lost faith in traditional authority. If bishops died alongside beggars, if noble blood provided no protection against plague, then perhaps the social hierarchies that had seemed eternal were just human constructions after all. This loss of faith in authority would have revolutionary consequences in the centuries that followed. Others turned to religious extremism, convinced that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Flagellant movements swept across Europe, with processions of penitents whipping themselves bloody in hopes of appeasing God's wrath. Some communities turned to scapegoating, blaming Jews, foreigners, or other minority groups for causing the plague through poisoning or witchcraft. By the end of 1348, Europe's urban civilization lay in ruins. Cities that had been centers of power, culture, and commerce were graveyards. The interconnected world of medieval Europe, with its trade networks and cultural exchanges, had been shattered. The continent was ready for the final act of this medieval apocalypse, the complete transformation of European society. The plague had destroyed the old world. Now survivors would have to build a new one from the ashes. As 1349 dawned, Europe was unrecognizable. The continent that had entered 1348 as a thriving, populous, interconnected civilization had been reduced to a landscape of abandoned villages, ruined cities, and traumatized survivors. But the Black Death wasn't finished yet. It would continue to ravage Europe for several more years, and its effects would reshape European society in ways that are still visible today. The immediate aftermath of the plague's peak year was chaos on an unprecedented scale. With roughly half of Europe's population dead or dying, the basic functions of society had to be rebuilt from scratch. This wasn't just a matter of economic recovery, it was the fundamental reimagining of how human society could function. Let's start with the most basic problem: labor. Medieval Europe had been a world of surplus population, where land was scarce and workers were plentiful. Suddenly, the situation was reversed. There were vast tracts of farmland with no one to work them, enormous construction projects with no workers to complete them, and trade networks with no merchants to operate them. The surviving peasants quickly realized they were in an unprecedented position of power. For centuries, they had been bound to the land, obligated to work for their lords in exchange for protection and a small plot to farm for themselves. But now lords were desperate for workers, and peasants could demand better conditions, higher wages, and greater freedom. This led to what historians call the Golden Age of labor. Wages for agricultural workers increased dramatically, sometimes doubling or tripling within a few years. Peasants who had lived in poverty for generations suddenly found themselves with disposable income. They could afford better food, better clothing, better housing. Some even began to accumulate savings. The feudal system, which had organized European society for centuries, began to crumble. Lords who tried to maintain the old arrangements found their peasants simply walking away to find better opportunities elsewhere. Serfdom, the system that bound peasants to the land, became increasingly unworkable when serfs could easily escape to regions where their labor was desperately needed. In England, this labor shortage led to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, one of the most significant popular uprisings in medieval history. The revolt was brutally suppressed, but it marked the beginning of the end for serfdom in Western Europe. Similar uprisings occurred across the continent as peasants demanded recognition of their newfound economic power. The plague also transformed urban life in fundamental ways. Cities that had been overcrowded before 1348 suddenly had abundant space. Survivors could afford larger homes, better neighborhoods, more comfortable lives. The desperate poverty that had characterized medieval urban life began to ease. This urban transformation was particularly visible in the rise of what historians call the middle class. Before the plague, European society had been dominated by a small elite of nobles and clergy, with the vast majority of people living in various degrees of poverty. The plague created new opportunities for social mobility. Surviving artisans, merchants, and professionals found themselves with less competition and more resources. Some accumulated significant wealth and began to challenge the traditional dominance of the nobility. The economic changes were profound and lasting. The shortage of workers led to rapid technological innovation as people looked for ways to accomplish tasks with fewer hands. Water mills and windmills proliferated. New agricultural techniques were developed. The pace of technological change, which had been relatively slow during the High Middle Ages, accelerated dramatically. Trade patterns also shifted fundamentally. The great commercial networks that had connected Europe before the plague were shattered, but new ones emerged to take their place. Cities that had been minor trading centers before 1348 suddenly found themselves elevated to major commercial hubs. Venice and Genoa, while still important, faced new competition from northern European cities like Antwerp and Hamburg. The plague also had profound cultural and intellectual effects. The catastrophe had shattered many traditional beliefs and assumptions. People who had lived through the complete breakdown of social order were less likely to accept traditional authority without question. This skepticism would contribute to the intellectual flowering of the Renaissance and, eventually, to the Protestant Reformation. Art and literature of the post-plague period reflected the trauma of the experience. The Dance of Death became a popular artistic theme, with skeletons leading people of all social classes to their graves, emphasizing the universality of death. Literature became more introspective and psychological, as writers tried to make sense of the catastrophe they had witnessed. Religious life was permanently altered. The Catholic Church had lost enormous numbers of clergy during the plague, and many survivors had lost faith in the Church's ability to provide protection or explanation for the catastrophe. New religious movements emerged, often emphasizing personal piety over institutional authority. The stage was set for the religious upheavals that would sweep Europe in the following centuries. The demographic recovery from the plague was slow and uneven. Some regions didn't return to their pre-plague population levels until the 16th century. This long period of reduced population had significant environmental consequences. Forests that had been cleared for agriculture during the population boom of the High Middle Ages began to regrow. Wildlife populations recovered. In some ways, Europe became a more environmentally sustainable place. The genetic impact of the plague is still visible today. Modern genetic studies have shown that Europeans carry mutations that provide resistance to plague bacteria, mutations that became more common in the population after 1348. The Black Death literally changed the human gene pool. Perhaps most importantly, the plague marked the end of the medieval world and the beginning of the early modern period. The social, economic, and cultural changes set in motion by the Black Death would eventually lead to the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, the Scientific Revolution, and the emergence of modern European civilization. The survivors of the Black Death had witnessed the complete destruction of their world, but they had also seen evidence of human resilience and adaptability. They learned that civilizations, no matter how stable they might seem, are fragile constructions that can be swept away by forces beyond human control. But they also learned that humans are remarkably capable of rebuilding, of adapting, of creating new forms of social organization from the ruins of the old. The Europe that emerged from the plague years was in many ways a better place to live than the Europe that had existed before 1348. It was less crowded, more prosperous for the survivors, more socially mobile, and more open to new ideas. The catastrophe had cleared away many of the rigid structures that had constrained medieval life, creating space for innovation and change. The Black Death was the worst natural disaster in European history, but it was also, paradoxically, one of the most transformative. It destroyed the medieval world but created the conditions for the modern world to emerge. The plague years were the fulcrum on which European history turned, the moment when the medieval period ended and the early modern period began. In the end, the story of the Black Death is not just a story of catastrophe and death. It's a story of human resilience, of society's ability to rebuild itself after total collapse, of the ways in which even the worst disasters can become catalysts for positive change. The Europe that emerged from the plague years was fundamentally different from the Europe that had entered them, transformed by fire into something new and, in many ways, better. The ships that had carried death from Kaffa to Mediterranean ports in 1347 had indeed changed the world. But perhaps not in the way anyone could have imagined. They had brought not just destruction, but transformation. Not just an ending, but a beginning.